behalf of the Committee on Minority in Economics, maybe better known as MinE. So the idea of today's session is really to reflect and recognize the best paper presented in the annual Congress that focus on better understanding on economic constraint faced by minority group. So any groups related to gender, disability, and sexual orientation. So I'm very happy today to have here with me Donia Kamel, who is a PhD candidate at PSC, I guess on the job market this year. Yes, okay. So she was she has been awarded to the 2025 MinE Award for her paper Between Arab and White, Syrian and US Naturalization Law. And then we're going to also hear from two other recognized papers selected by the MinE committee. Kristina Manysheva, she's assistant professor at Columbia Business School, and Joan Martinez, postdoc fellow at UC Berkeley. So I also guess Joan is on the market this year, and it's if you're based in California, it's very early on for you. So thanks for joining. So each presenter will have 20 minutes, and I will suggest to let the speaker talk for at least 10 minutes without interruption, and then maybe we have we can start to ask questions after the first 10 minutes. Okay, so with that, let's begin. I'm very pleased to invite Donia to present her award-winning paper. Donia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm just gonna share my screen.
Yes.
Okay, let me just minimize. Yeah. Can you all see it? Okay. Great.
Yes.
Okay, so I think I have like 15 minutes plus 20 minutes in total. Okay, great.
Exactly.
So my paper is titled Between Arab and White, Syrians in the US Naturalization Law. So this paper essentially looks at Arab immigrants from Greater Syria to the US during the age of mass migration and how they navigated the naturalization law that was in place at the time. So the main motivation behind this is that we know that across countries, really naturalization policies is central to debates about how access to it shapes political, economic, and social integration into host societies. And there's a lot of debate between policymakers, academics, and civil society actors that disagree of whether we should expand or restrict access to naturalization. And this debate is even made more politicized and fueled because of widespread misperceptions about immigrants' population. So whether it's about their size, their impact, or their characteristics. And really at the core of this debate are key trade-offs for immigrant assimilation. So does expanded access to naturalization or citizenship encourage assimilation by lowering social and legal barriers to integration, or does it enable some sort of cultural distinctiveness by securing rights that reduce the pressure to conform? And to motivate this further, we've been seeing that historically, but also recently, that most legal policies have imposed barriers to immigrant integration. So this is a satirical snippet from The Onion that says, revised citizenship test requires immigrants to name every US state where they're not welcome. So just to show the exclusionary feel that some of these policies tend to have. But in my paper, I look in contrast to a rare case of legal inclusion where Arab immigrants were classified as racially and legally white. So this was a specific ruling of Dow versus United States that classified Arabs specifically from Greater Syria as legally white and therefore granting them eligibility for naturalization. And the main research question is that how does legal inclusion affect immigrants' assimilation effort given the trade-offs that we've just discussed? So just to summarize the full paper in one slide, so we've said that this essentially reshapes the cost and benefit trade-off of assimilation. So if we were to expect that there is an increase in assimilation effort, this would translate into less foreign-sounding names, intermarriage, and residential integration. On the other hand, we can expect that there is some sort of cultural distinctiveness. They would still name their kids Arabic names, marry within the ethnic group, and live within the ethnic enclave. So to try to understand this, or try to answer this question, I use historical full count US Census data and unique Arabic language data. But for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus more on the census outcomes. So first, I start with naming patterns. So this is naming patterns of the second generation US-born children to Arab parents. And I do a within family exercise comparing siblings born before and after the ruling within the same family, but also to mitigate concerns with general assimilation trends. I do a cohort diff and diff comparing Arabs to other groups. And we see that there is a strong shift towards having less and less foreign sounding names. So this is through the FNI index, which is essentially, if we benchmark it to the literature of the work of Abramitsky and Leibustan, that this is approximately accelerating assimilation by almost 2 decades of maternal US exposure. And we can talk about this once we interpret the results. I do heterogeneity by parental characteristics, legal certainty, and name Americanization using the knowledge of the Arabic language. And then I turn to the first generation. I look at intermarriage with natives, so comparing the first generation Arab men to other groups in a different diff setting. And we also find that there is a significant increase in intermarriage rates post the ruling, while residential integration lagged a bit behind. And then I tried to bring it back again to the second generation and ask that now that we've seen there is strong name assimilation patterns, did this name assimilation essentially pay off on the labor market in 1940 in the US Census? And we actually see that it did translate to higher wages and shifting into different occupations. So all in all, this paper really tries to provide direct causal evidence that legal inclusion and access to naturalization really promotes assimilation. So to give you the broader context, so this is based on the Naturalization Act of 1870, where naturalization was limited to aliens being free white persons and aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent. So the last bit was added after the US Civil War. And at the same time, we have the age of mass migration, where 30 million Europeans migrated to the US, but we also have other migration from other groups. And therefore, by construction, determining who qualified as white or not was especially hard during this period. And it's important to note that it was only in 1952 that racial prerequisites to naturalization were completely removed in the US. So to zoom more into this case, so Dow versus United States was a US Court of Appeals Fourth Circuit case where George Dow, a Syrian immigrant, appealed 2 lower court decisions that denied his application for naturalization as a US citizen. So just to give you what the court said, in color, he was said to be darker than the usual person of white European descent, and of that tinge or sallow appearance which usually accompanies persons of descent other than purely European. So we get the gist of the text from the court. So this case finally led to the naturalization of Dow based on the generally received opinion that inhabitants of a portion of Asia, including Syria, are to be classified as white persons. So this essentially resulted in an extension of the privilege of being an American citizen to Arab Christians, which formed 95% of immigrants from the Arab world. We have racial prerequisite cases later on for Arabs from other countries in the Arab world, and also for Muslims and so on. So the first measure of of assimilation effort that I look at is names, as I said before, and I hope I don't need to convince anyone that names are an important measure of assimilation. They're markers of culture, identity, and they differ across social and ethnic groups. So how I think about names is that first I use the foreign name index, which essentially measures the frequency of a name within an ethnic group relative to its frequency in the population at large. So it's usually defined as such using information on the names up until the birth cohort of the individual in question. But in my context, I define it from the pre-period so that I can avoid any bias or feedback loop where post-ruling naming behavior would influence the measure itself. So essentially, I would be measuring how the distribution of naming choices evolves relative to a consistent reference. And just to show you descriptively, if we just plot the distributions of the FNI for the pre and the post, we see that in the pre-distribution, there is a much higher density in FNI, and a higher FNI score means that this name is distinctively much more Arab and distinctively apparent within this ethnic group. So this would be, for example, names such as Shafiq or Nasif, which are distinctively Arabic names. And then in the post distribution, we have less of these names and more of names that have very low FNI. So this would be Wesley or Marvin, just to give you an example. And to try to take a better causal step, I first do a within family analysis comparing male siblings born within the same family, born before and after the ruling. And we just see that the siblings born after the ruling receive significantly less foreign names, which amounts to almost a decline in FNI scale by 7.8 points. So this would mean a shift from a pre-treatment average name, such as Basil, for example, to Ralph or Danny. And also to benchmark this against what the literature does. So we know from the work of Abramitsky and Bustan that a mother being in the US for 10 years is associated with a decline FNI by 4 points. So if we were to interpret this coefficient, it would mean that we're accelerated assimilation by almost 2 decades of the mother being in the US. And just to show you the event study, the naming was quite stable pre the ruling, and then there's a sharp drop in foreignness after the ruling. I do a bunch of heterogeneity and mechanisms. I think for the sake of time, we can skip them, but I'm happy to take more questions about them. And then, as I said before, to rule out any general assimilation trends or any issues with the exercise that we just looked at, I do a cohort diff analysis where I estimate the following specification. So here I'm looking at US-born children to Arab fathers versus other groups. And my primary control groups are Poles, because they were generally considered as white, and therefore this would offer a sharp contrast with the Arabs, and they also arrived at the same time. So if we were to estimate this specification, we see that naming patterns evolved similarly pre-1915, comparing the Arabs to the Poles, and we see a similar decrease post-1915, smaller in magnitude, but still very significant. So essentially here we're just capturing the differential effect of the Dow ruling on the second generation Arabs relative to the control group. And this exercise can be done also to other groups, especially the other white groups, and we see that the result is quite robust too. And now I can turn to other outcomes that are not fully under the control of individuals, but depend on coordination with natives and their attitudes. So here I look into intermarriage and residential integration. So this is done at the first generation level. And for intermarriage, I'm essentially estimating the specification where I create a marriage year panel using the age at first marriage variable that is only available in the 1930 census to create a marriage year panel. And then the intermarriage outcome is defined as if the Arab men or Polish man married a native white woman of native parentage. And we see that even within across the different windows and trend adjusting, there is a strong increase in intermarriage rates amounting to almost 2 percentage points after the ruling. And for the sake of this, I'm skipping residential integration as it's more suggestive, and I think I'm a bit tight on time. And then I tried to bring it back again to the labor outcomes. So here, the natural question that we've seen that there is a strong shift towards having less and less foreign sounding names. So the natural question, did assimilation pay off? So did the second generation Arabs with less foreign sounding names benefit more in the labor market once they were recognized as white? So the main rationale behind this is that we know that names are salient signals of assimilation, and there is a lot of evidence from the literature that Americanized or more familiar names are more associated with better callbacks, labor market outcomes, and so on. And the channels usually operate through statistical screening or preference and taste. So the way I think about this is that post this ruling, this reduced legal classification ambiguity shifts the decision margin from the group level to a within group sorting, so making the names a more signal measure of assimilation. So here I focus on the same group of the second generation Arab men from the 1920 census using their FNI score on the names and their parental characteristics, and I link them to the 1940 census, which is the first census wave that we have economic outcomes. So we have the wages and we have the industry and occupations they join. And just estimating the specification, we find that those that are born after foreign sounding names, they get much higher wages even within the same industry and the same occupation. So this almost is around 36% increase. And if we also look some preliminary evidence on which industries they join, so we see that they shift away from manufacturing, which is a very much immigrant-intensive job at the time, but they also shift into another occupational niche of the Arab migrants, which is self-employment and having their own shops and businesses. So to conclude, we've seen that Arab immigrants really responded to this case by adopting less foreign-sounding names and increasing intermarriage. And this is showing evidence of assimilation when barriers were lowered. And we've seen that this amounts to almost accelerating assimilation by almost 2 decades of US exposure of the parents. And in the paper, I also show that like even when legal barriers were secured, by looking at certain states where the case was immediately binding, we see there's still significant increases in assimilation. So this could be explained by motives of identity internalization and social acceptance. So this really highlights the enduring value of offering immigrants a clearer path to full civic inclusion. So in terms of ongoing extensions, I have some work on the Arab American newspapers to really try to trace identity debates, but I'm also looking into specific comparative cases, such as the Armenians who gained legal whiteness also, but the Japanese who were excluded in a Supreme Court case in 1923. And I think this project falls into a general umbrella of an agenda that I'm trying to build on identity and diaspora politics, specifically looking at how different identities evolve upon migration and how certain immigrant groups really rise into political incorporation in certain contexts. So I think that's it for me. I'm very happy to take questions. Sorry if it was too fast. I'm not sure if it was too fast.
Thank you, Donia. Perfect time. So let's see if there is any question from the audience. Otherwise, I actually have a question. But let's give the floor to other. Yeah, Kristina.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. Just like, I mean, you had to go very fast because of the shortage of time. I think when it comes to from assimilation to economic outcomes, where you see the higher wages, shall I think about this? Because the control group seems to be the one that did not get the more Western name, but this is kind of what name you gives is endogenous. So parents, we might think that the parents that give more Western name, they also invest more in education. They're kind of targeting future outcomes. So they're like have in mind future outcome of the child. So
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, definitely. So this is definitely, like I said, just a very much suggestive exercise. Like there's a lot of limitations from linking to endogeneity. But I think how I think about this is that we know that names are like they do affect the labor market outcomes in general. So we see that people with Americanized names, they do better on the labor market. But how I think about this is that now this legal uncertainty is resolved. So the screening is no longer at the group level, but it's within the group level. So names are valued more after this ruling, essentially. So this is why we see this increase for those that have low FNI. But it also controlled for a bunch of benchmark parental characteristics, like years in the US, like any assimilation level that could be captured through the parental side. But I hope this answers your question.
Okay, thanks. So I was also curious about one thing because so the fact that these newborn children have more American names after the introduction of the legalization and the impact. So the impact on the labor market. So you are kind of selling this as the fact that maybe there is less stigmatization from the labor market sides or something like. I'm thinking a little bit about the channel. What I have in mind is a model where actually American names are, for example, much more easier to remember or to memorize or to understand or to write compared to, an Arabic type of name. And so maybe you're just more likely to remember someone. And this is not really a stigmatization / identity issues, but more a fact that maybe. So I was wondering whether you did any exercise to try to understand the different channels that might going on in there.
Not really, no, but I'm like very much aware that this is like very suggestive and it's very hard to pinpoint which way is it. Is it preference or really just normal screening? So I'm not sure, but if you have like any idea on how to pinpoint this, that would be great. But yeah, this is just like something that tries to tie up the paper at the end, like very suggestive, not as causal as the previous.
So maybe what I was thinking is that maybe you can try to train artificial intelligence model where you put like a very difficult Arabic. You have all the American names, right? So you can compare maybe like the level of the degree of difficulties in understanding or writing, and compare this. You like compare the most difficult names with the most difficult American versus Arabic name, and see whether there is a stronger effect, for example, for the easier name to pronounce or something like that. I think it's something that you can try to do, and then if there are no difference between the two, then you say this is maybe can be,
Perfect.
I don't know, it's
Thank you.
just like,
Yeah.
but
Thank you.
okay. Okay, let's see if there are any other questions for Donia. Okay, so I think great. Thank you, Donia. And we can move to Kristina then.
Yes, I will try to be as on time as normal. Okay. Okay, thank you so much for having me. This is Joan to work with Martina and Joanna, End of Apartheid, Not of Inequalities, a Slow Transition and Segregated Economy. And Joanna, one of the co-authors, she's at the IMF, so regular disclaimer is applied here. So when we think about South Africa, and was kind of where we came, how we started the paper, it's a country that went through a very tragic episode named Apartheid, which is a harsh system of racial segregation in various forms. It lasted almost for 50 years and was abolished in 1994. However, if we look in South Africa today, we see that a lot of things, and we are now 30 years post this regime, many things still persist. And specifically, one of the results of this racial segregation was the highest inequality in the world, primarily driven by inequality between Black and white racial groups. But if we look at South Africa today, despite the fact that, at least legally, we observe that all racial groups now have free access to education, health, finance, and jobs, and on top of this, there are various policies that are trying to address inequality in this country, we still observe that it is still pretty much the most unequal country in the world with the highest Gini, both in terms of earnings and the wealth. And particularly, those numbers are very strikingly high for Black part of the population. And one thing that, however, changed in South Africa compared to the apartheid period, which I already mentioned, where inequality was primarily driven by the inequality across racial groups. Now, if we look at the numbers, this rise or persistence in inequality is primarily driven by increasing inequality within racial groups, specifically within Black people. And on top of this, not only inequality increases, a substantial chunk of Black population is left behind. So they're not really any improvement in terms of their average income. And particularly if we focus on those who live in metropolitan areas since the end of apartheid. And the question we're up for in this paper is what drives this inequality increase and persistence at least. And we think that there is a special role of spatial organizations that was designed during apartheid system, namely townships. So township, just like a brief definition, it's within urban areas, it's segregated areas which were dedicated to specific racial group and even more to specific ethno-linguistic group that was on the periphery of the town. So in a sense, it's a little bit similar to slums. The only thing that it was done by design, it didn't arrive endogenously, and it's much further away from the city core, meaning that the transportation cost and access to all the economic activity is much further. So just to illustrate and to understand how it is, I'm going to show you two maps. On the left side, there is a map of Cape Town area dating back to the apartheid period. So you can see that there is like clear distinction where each racial or ethno-linguistic group was allowed to reside. And the whole CBD or Central Business District, where all the economic activity was happening, was dedicated for white group people. And then you see the townships, which were where a certain group was allocated to live and required to live. And you see like Black townships, colorist townships, and so on. On the right side, you see the same map of the same area, but now coming from the data in 2011 or from 2011 census. What is striking here, and it also kind of shows you what is density in terms of different population groups across different areas. So what is striking here, yes, when we look at CBD or Central Business District, we observe some mixing happening. So yes, it's still predominantly white, but we observe that there is a little bit more of other racial groups also residing there. But if we look at what previously used to be apartheid townships, they pretty much homogeneous in terms of their racial composition, and not only they're homogeneous in the sense that the white people do not move there, but we also observe that the one that were allocated towards colors people during the apartheid are still pretty much colored, the one that allocated to the Black people, still pretty much Black, and the borders of those townships did not really change. So here you can see Kailicha, it's here, and then on the very left, there's even tiny townships that still remain in place. So I think that they're like important since we observe those patterns very visually on the map. So what we do in this paper, how we approach the question why inequality is still so high and even increasing, at least within certain groups, we use apartheid period to study the role of segregation. And when I say segregation, I don't have in mind segregation only based on where people live, like what I showed you on the map. We think about segregation very broadly. In a sense, segregation in labor market, segregation in education, segregation in residential choice, and what is effect on the rise or persistence of inequality. So how do we do this? We combine both the data and the model. And in terms of the model approach, we kind of combine two very canonical models that could speak towards very slow or very persistent processes given the initial conditions. So for those of you who are familiar with structural models or macro development, one canonical would be Rakabowski-Sheen, where the slow process of asset accumulation makes many people left behind for a very long period of time. And the second model is a Becker-Thoms, where they highlight the slow process of education accumulation because it takes generations to get college degree and so on. So we combine those two models together and we add another layer that we observe very visibly in the data is geographic segmentation on top of this. So of course, the model setting is justified by the stylized facts that we observe in the data. And I'm going to show you some of those stylized facts. And then we use this data in order to calibrate the model and validate this. And then the question, what we're asking using this model, and here I want to have like very clear language. So in the model, we assume that post-apartheid, there is no discrimination. That being said, it's not that we think that there is no discrimination. What we're up to, given initial condition, given the historical episode of extreme segregation and discrimination, can we explain what's happening today purely with economic forces? Can those slow processes of asset accumulation and educational accumulation, given very poor initial conditions for majority of Blacks in South Africa, explain why the processes are moving in the way they are now? And of course, this is paper about South Africa, but the framework is a bit more general and can be applied to other settings where we observe those different segmentation in different markets. And given that I'm probably going to be out of time, let me give you the preview of the results. So kind of one of the probably positive thing that we conclude using the models that we're still in the transition. So we're still not yet reaching the steady state. So the economy of South Africa is still moving towards lower inequality, new steady state. And when we think about this canonical model or the models that embed very canonical elements of slow transition, just within economics, it's actually able to predict a lot of patterns we observe today in South Africa in terms of the income and wealth inequality within and across races, in terms of education and access to jobs. Except what model is not able to justify without any type of frictions or distortions is this huge spatial inequality in a sense that the model would predict way more mixing based on economic kind of outcomes or economic opportunities. So this is what model is not able to justify. Therefore, we think about what the model is lacking in order to actually being able to match the data. And so one thing that we consider, we try many things, and one thing that kind of required to prevent mixing both in terms of jobs and location is location-specific wedge or friction that imposes that running a business in a township is not as profitable as in the city core. And unfortunately, we're not doing any kind of matching of what is this wedge in the model versus in the data. And we think there are maybe, and partially we're not doing this because we think there are maybe could be a lot of factors. Clearly, infrastructure in township is not the same as in city core. There might be some criminality, but also just purely economic non-tradables could stand for it. So we're not taking stance why running business is not as profitable in township as in the city core, but we find this is one of the core elements that has to be present in order to match the model and the data. And this location-specific friction makes the process way slower compared to the world where actually opening business and running this business in township would be as profitable as the city core. Specifically, we observed that even in the steady state, income inequality in this case still going to be higher, and it's much slower process of convergence. And therefore, this kind of highlights the role of place-based policies. And maybe we should target not only people, but also places, and then this may help. So now I think like I have like around 7 minutes left. So I'm gonna try to show you stylized facts, and I don't want you to take those stylized facts as something causal. It's just what we observe in the data in terms of evolution. We do a lot of data collection, and what we see here, both from the historical perspective and what we observe now, that first in terms of the inequality. So we're able to decompose inequality into within the racial groups and across racial groups just at the end of apartheid and today. And what we observe here strikingly that inequality is rising. And the main driver of this inequality increase is rising inequality within Black population rather than across racial groups. Second, what drives those kind of inequality? Who are those Black peoples that are left behind and those who actually, for whom income is increasing? What drives this increase of inequality within Black group? So first, we see that returns to college or returns to education everywhere in the world is very high, but in South Africa is particularly high and even higher for Black population compared to the whites. So basically, this plot shows average income across two different racial groups for people within this racial group of different level of education. And we see that the returns to higher education, and particularly of Blacks, once they get college degree, or those who get college degree, their income almost like 4 times bigger than compared to those who finish secondary school. So returns to education are very high. So clearly there's an important mechanism through which income is being driven in this country. Second, in terms of the jobs, we're able to separate people who are workers versus those who are running their own business. And here's a striking thing that we find that returns to entrepreneurship or running your own business are quite high, but it's not the same across racial groups. So this is very true for white people. This is not very true for Black people. So for Black people, you could see that the returns to running your own business is not very high. However, there is a bit of hidden heterogeneity happening there. Then we separate kind of those who running their own business versus working for somebody else based on their level of education on top of what job they're doing. So here we see that it's true if we look on Blacks and whites who do not have higher education or do not have college degree, this is where we do not observe any returns to running your own business for Blacks primarily, while for whites, we still see that there is like those who run their own business have higher income. This is not the same pattern if we look at people with higher college degree. For them, both for Blacks and whites, returns to education and returns to business are kind of correlated and much, much higher compared to being employed by someone else. So here, this brings us to potentially some financial frictions being present and interaction between education and the job you're doing. Finally, just the last fact I want to show between
Kristina, can I interrupt you for a sec? Because I think I have a question related to the graph you're showing, so better to ask it now than at the end.
Yeah.
When you show us the return to education, the first, yes, this one. Okay, I missed because I was curious to see whether whether like at the primary level, you on average have the same number of enrollment for Black and white, and I was expecting that this is much closer, but you didn't show. I thought the first one was actually primary and then secondary and then higher. But okay, so do you know if the gap is actually larger as in for secondary and tertiary, or is it much smaller?
No, it doesn't. It seems that the gap across within groups between blacks and whites seems to be very similar. So there might be some still discrimination happening. Again, we're not trying to say that there is none. The only things that to mention, and this like probably because of lack of time, I couldn't explain that this plot contains a bit more information that I conveyed because the size of the bubble reflects how many people within racial group of certain level of education. So you can see that within blacks, it's still very few who getting higher education, way more among whites. And then if we add here primary education, the amount with primary education among whites is going to be pretty much zero. So it's very hard to say whether there is difference in the returns. That's why we don't put even primary. Of course, among blacks, there is still a lot of people with just primary education. Among whites, this number is zero, pretty much. I mean, maybe it's 1%, but it's like zero.
Yeah. No, that's okay. Thank you.
And similarly here, of course, the bubbles, but it's like was a bit too much information for one presentation. Now going to like the spatial allocation, we're able to look at the evolution of the average income of those who reside in the city versus township. And again, here is selection happening on the background because post-apartheid, people free to choose where to live. So we, of course, expect that people who get the best jobs are pretty much moving to the city. So there is selection happening. But what is striking here, while like the city income or average income in the city is growing, even conditional on selection, those who remain in township, their income pretty much haven't changed since the end of apartheid. So this is what's happening on their like residential level in terms of the average income. But the other important thing is where people work and where people live. So what we have additional data. We observe those location choices. And this is what kind of highlights why we brought the wedge of friction the way we brought. Because if we look at people who reside in the city or in the core of the city, pretty much all of them work and study or send their children to school and college in the city. If we look at those who live in township, the one striking thing, majority of them, or 75%, actually working in the city. So they have to commute to work. There are very few jobs available in townships. It's not only residents of townships, they are more poor. Majority of them have to commute to work. And what is specific about South Africa, the transportation costs extremely high. So they're around 10% by very conservative estimates. Some estimates suggest 30 to 50% of the income. So those are very high, which makes the paper really about South Africa and maybe not about Chicago or any other segregated city. So now I have to cut really, but like I want to tell you what we embed in the model framework. So it's very rich model. So I'm going to do it with, instead of equations, I'm just going to show you one picture. So the elements we have in the model is heterogeneous agent. It has incomplete markets. Specifically, we have financial frictions, again, coming to the fact that differences we observe in terms of returns to entrepreneurship. Of course, once we estimate the model, we have to take into account the race because during the apartheid, everything was discriminated. But how then we will track this race, but post-apartheid, this will not be reflected in any of your economic opportunities. Not the outcomes, of course, but not in opportunities. Then they're going to be human capital. The parents will decide on the level and type of education for their children. Households will choose for the adults their occupation. It could be running your own business and we'll have different technologies, or you can become a worker or employed by somebody else, either as a low skill or high skill worker. And finally, we'll have the spatial aspect. This is additional layer where you can choose between two locations, between city core and the township, and you make those choices both in terms of the labor market, in terms of education market, and in terms of the residential market. And they don't need to be the same. They can be that similarly to the data, you live in one place and you work in another place. Again, a little bit more technicalities. It's general equilibrium, OLG dynasties, and there are household state, as I already told. It's racial, some talent, some human capital accumulation, and endogenous asset accumulation. So I just want to, because I have like 1 minute, so I just want to go to the model with distortions, really 2 slides left. So the very final models that we think matches the data pretty well is where we have the wedge. when running a business in a township is way less profitable compared to the city. We validate this model with the data, but just to give you a sense, what are the numbers, how big this wedge is. So it's not we're imposing that there's like, oh, running a business is impossible in township. We're just saying that based on the data, once we calibrate, running a business in township is around 15% less profitable compared to the city. And again, we validate this with the data. And what we find with this model with the wedge, that the transition is much slower. And why it's much slower? Because if you think about typical paths that the model predicts, how the blacks who started with very low level of education post-apartheid because they were forbidden to go to college. They start with very low level of assets because they all had to take low-skilled jobs. So they start with very poor initial conditions. How they can make it to the top? What is a typical path of any person who starts with very low initial conditions? So the typical path would be to become traditional entrepreneur. It's like having like kind of self-employed. Then through this entrepreneurship, they're able to accumulate some wealth, and they're moving either to bigger businesses or they send their children to college. And then the next generation, possibly, they're going either to take higher skilled jobs or they expand business even further. So this is kind of the typical path. And of course, once you make this wedge in the location of township, this makes this process much, much slower because accumulation of assets becomes, and getting access to other things becomes way more costly. And it's a bit work in progress. So the model is a bit lagging behind compared to the data because of the time periods that we embed in the model. So we're working like on new version where we set time period to 5 years to slightly better manage the data, but it's not going to change the outcome or the main qualitative outcome of what we're saying. So just going to show the time period. And I'm going to stop here. I think I kind of highlighted everything because I'm out of time.
Thank you, Kristina, for the excellent paper. So I put a question I have in the chat so that I don't want to, but maybe other people from the audience have some questions. Okay, so maybe I can read mine and then we quickly move to Joan. I was curious to see, like, at the very beginning when you show us the two maps before and after the apartheid. So the first question is, I work a little bit in South Africa and I lived there for a while. And so the first question is, it's kind of tricky to observe that these townships are really in the middle of the city center and not actually very segregated. So I guess you're explaining why a little bit in the paper to have some context on it, but I think it's interesting. And second, I mean, moving like or completely change the urban setting of a city is very complicated. So I think one important variable that you want to look at is exactly how transportation system actually evolve over time. Because maybe you don't observe that township, but you observe that these townships are more linked to the city center, so on and so forth. So
yeah, so I'm just gonna try to give very quick
and then,
answer.
John, you should be ready to start in a sec.
Yeah. And so the thing is like they're all spread because this was design of white people during the apartheid. They want some natural buffer, so they want labor force to work for them, but not be close enough or reside close enough. And presence of these natural buffers, whether it's the forest, whether it's a river, made the transportation very complicated. So this is one reason why you don't have townships kind of like being nearby, similar to slums, which makes the paper a bit more about South Africa than some other things. In terms of transportation, so there is like many anecdotal evidence why transportation is not improving or improving. What we see in the model, since the location is kind of exogenous, was designed during the apartheid, we see that the townships that are further away, they on average doing much worse than the township closer to the city. And we kind of show this in the model and the data, and partially it's through the selection process. It's not just because, oh, naturally, there is selection happening and selection affects this. But the thing is that kind of still transportation costs are extremely high. As I told, like, can you imagine? I mean, I'm complaining about like, oh, New York City subway is $3 per ride, but it's not 30% of my income. It's like 30% of income, it's insane. It's just like very, very big and make things much worse. And for townships that are further away, they even worse. And therefore, since there's all these problems with infrastructure, we're kind of like, but given the townships are so much worse and running business so much worse, maybe we can focus on some place-based policies, because one of the key wedge is that people have to commute to jobs in the city. Not that they are far away necessarily per se, but because all the jobs are in the city and none of the jobs being created in the township. So one of the solution is to bring jobs to people if we couldn't improve infrastructure because of some natural barriers. But this is something you could explore within the model. But the real trick for policymakers is to identify what exactly this wedge. Because if this wedge is if infrastructure or criminality, this is something the government can address. If this, what we call wedge, is just non-tradables because level of income of townships is too low to open any business there, then this is not something the government can fix and they should focus on different areas.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Joan, the floor is yours, and sorry for running a little bit late.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Great. So thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to present a paper, Market Forces and Employer Racial Preferences, Evidence from Wartime Shortages. And this is joint work with Elora Duran-Court. So the key motivation for this project is understanding the connection between labor market tightness and employer racial preferences, because this has become an increasingly relevant economic problem. Long-standing trends show that an aging workforce is creating binding constraints across a vast number of industries and regions, both in the US and also in Europe and abroad. However, employers often maintain racial preferences in hiring and recruiting despite having these economic incentives not to. We know from Becker's framework that firms have to trade off between productive efficiency on one side against preference satisfaction on the other side, and they have to pay a premium to hire their preferred group of workers. As labor markets tighten and preferred workers become more scarce, this trade-off becomes increasingly consequential, because the economic penalty for maintaining their preferences rises as the scarcity premium on the preferred workers also increases. So in this context, we study a key parameter in the literature of discrimination, which is the elasticity of racial preferences with respect to labor supply. This is largely unidentified in the literature because of essentially the lack of data expressing racial preferences from employers, which is one of our main contributions in this work. And we posed two research questions to make progress in characterizing this parameter. The first one is, to what extent do labor shortages affect employer racial preferences in hiring? And the second is, how do these changes in recruiting preferences translate into differential outcomes or improvements for workers depending on their race? So the paper provides answers to these questions in 4 parts. In the first part, we construct what it is to the best of our knowledge, the largest historical data set that links explicit racial preferences to labor market outcomes for the US. This is novel data that combines 16.8 million job advertisements that span from 1900s until 1970, and this comes from 13 different newspapers. We also have linked World War II military records, and specifically from the draft system, with a census panel that comes from the census, from the decennial census, the full count decennial census. So we have extensively validated the newspaper's data against the decennial census, and we have checked that there is a match between the employment distributions at 2-digit and 4-digit SOC levels of precisions. We follow Atale and co-authors in order to validate the newspaper's data. We construct different empirical patterns that document the evolution of explicit racial preferences before the civil rights legislation. And this is very important because this is one of the main confounders in a lot of these studies. In the second part of the paper, we look at the effects at the local labor market level. We estimate the effects of the labor supply shocks on racial preferences in recruiting. And more specifically, we look at the identifying variation that comes from World War II draft rates. So the draft rates are essentially measured as the number of white males aged between 25 to 45, which is the age of a conscription for World War II, that were taken out of the 1940 labor force. We construct this measure at the very granular level, which is the local labor market, defined as the combination between county and occupation cells. So we are exploiting here differential labor supply across all of these county occupation cells. The source of exogeneity here is that these draft rates were determined by the pre-war age structure, which is unrelated to racial attitudes that occur later during the war. And the research design that we use for this part of the paper is a difference in difference design, where we include market and year fixed effects, and we have a very robust battery of robustness checks, including additional controls and specifications. So here we want to isolate the causal effect of these relative shrinkage of white labor force as opposed to Black workers. And we want to see how do the share of job postings changes for those areas that were more affected by the shock. We also have a model that I'm going to skip for today's presentation. And in the last part of the paper, we have a discussion of what are the effects on the workers. We look at the effect on the racial gap between Black and white workers using individual level census panel data. So we have matched the new census from 1950 to the census of 1940 to see how do workers that were exposed to a higher intensity of the draft because they lived in these more affected local labor markets do later in 1950 in terms of earnings and in terms of also of employment. So we use a panel of approximately 1.9 million males, ages between 15 to 65 that have been matched. And we use a triple difference in difference specification where we compare the labor outcomes from individual Black workers versus white workers across these markets that have different levels of exposure. The identifying assumption is pretty standard here that in the absence of the draft-induced labor shortages, the Black and white gap in outcomes would have evolved similarly across markets that were exposed to different intensities. Great, so now let me give you a preview of the results. So first of all, we find that explicit racial preferences in job advertisements peaked during the interwar period between World War I and World War II, and they declined sharply after World War II. So this is one of the motivating stylist facts that started this project. And also here we find that white preferences reach 12% by the late 1930s, so like after the period of the Great Depression. And then Black preferences remain relatively lower all the time, between 2 to 5%. In the World War II marked a structural break in these time series that we construct. The white preferences fell below 5% during the war, and these effects were persistent throughout 1960, which is where we can observe also these series in the data set. Our second result is that the World War II draft created differential labor supply shocks through these age-based conscription requirements. This was a very algorithmic, rule-based system that required men from certain ages, according to certain rules and evaluations, to be drafted, to be eligible to be drafted to the war. So the Federal Selective Service System administered these conscription rules, and around 10 million men were inducted. 87% of these men were white. So this is the relative labor supply shock that we actually exploit in the paper, that was heavily drafting more white men than Black men that were left in the local labor markets, and there were still civilians. So these drafts reduced the relative white to Black labor supply, as I was saying, and whites were removed from the labor force participation. The third finding, which is one of our main findings, is that these draft-induced labor scarcity causally reduce explicit racial preferences in recruiting as measured with the job postings. So a 10 percentage point increase in the draft rates reduced the white preferred job postings by 1.1 percentage points. This is a decline that is equivalent to 7.5% of the pre-treatment means. And these effects were quite persistent. They persisted over 10 years after the demobilization, up to, as far as we can see, in 1960, these effects were still negative. So this is indicative of permanent shifts in employer practices and not just transitory changes due to the war. At the same time that we see a reduction in the share of white preferred job postings, we also see an increase in what we call racial neutral job postings. So the employers were definitely changing their behavior to be more open to other candidates. In the last part of the paper, we have as a motivation to see whether this was a factor, these draft induced labor shortages were a factor that changed the racial gap in income, or in particular in wages. We know that after World War II, there was a very important period of convergence between the income of Blacks and whites in the US. And we actually find that this scarcity was playing an important role also in closing that gap. So at mean exposure, which is 20.4% of draft rate affecting a particular county occupation cell, we find that the relative labor scarcity reduced the Black-white wage gap by 0.14 standard deviation. So this is a decline in the wages of whites of 35%, and a gain in Black wages by 8%. So this is the outline of the talk. I'm going to be focusing on the market level effects and just going over the series of new data sources that we have here. Great. So we have different sources of information. The first one is these historical newspapers that we have digitized. And we have selected a group of papers that provides us enough coverage, continuous coverage over this period. We have selected national newspapers, Southern newspapers, and also historically Black newspapers. We have structured these newspapers into delimited job postings. This was like a highly unstructured source of raw text of data that contained over 52 million of digitized newspaper images. And we classified the limited and topic model into and filter finally into getting a structured data set of job postings. In the end, we have, as I said, 16.8 million of job postings. So this is kind of like how the images look at first. We have no recognition of which are referring racial preferences for whites or Blacks, but we see that there's the occurrence of some words referring to those preferences. Then in the second stage, we have the job ads text after they have been cleaned and separated, because originally they're like just a continuous of strings. And finally, we do what it is our most important contribution in terms of methods, which is developing these three-stage racial term recognition algorithm, where we essentially use token matching first with historically comprehensive dictionaries. Then we apply lexical patterns to recognize what are the terms that are neighboring these main terms that, for instance, are white or Black. But however, these terms at vacuum are ambiguous. Sometimes they can refer to describing objects, not racial categories. So that's why we apply these additional layers of analysis. And finally, we also apply semantic embeddings, which are linguistic models recognizing the usage of these words. So as a result, we construct these series where we have here plotted the percentage of job postings specifying a racial preference on each year. So this is very granular. And we see that after World War II, there's a sharp decline, as I was indicating, and the series of Black preferences is always below the ones of white. So there was like a particular way of exclusion, which is not necessarily saying that you have a preference for Black, but also that you have a explicit preference towards white workers that you want to hire. Great. So I'm going very fast here, but I'm trying to now get to the market level effects of the war-induced labor shortages. So for here, we have the unit of analysis, which is the local labor market, which we observe only for this analysis between 1935 to 1960. We wanted to start after the Great Depression, not to have those confoundings. And as I said, the unit of analysis is the county occupation cell. For instance, Queens County, the occupation is manufacturing, and we have restricted the sample to all these markets that have over 20 years of data to have a non-noisy and reliable specification. The treatment is the draft-induced reduction in white male labor supply, which is constructed as this ratio, which is the number of white males of a certain age from 21 to 45 in a given market. And this is calculated over the number of white males in the same age range in the labor force in general, but in that market in 1940. The main outcome is going to be the share of job postings with explicit racial preferences. We have white racial preferences, Black racial preferences, and also race-neutral racial preferences, which is just the non-occurrence of any racial term in the text. So the estimation equation is this one is a classic diff and diff, where we have the outcome variable, which is the share of white preferred job postings in a given market at a given time. And the main variable of interest is the draft intensity that affected that market. We include a very comprehensive list of controls that are indicated here, but I'm going to go over to the results. So in this table, we can observe what are the effects of these labor scarcity and how do they affect like the different shares of job postings. So we find in the first column that the draft-induced labor shortages reduced the white preferred ads by around 1.1 percentage points. If we scale them to be to have the effect of a 10 percentage point increase in the draft rate. We have no effect on the Black preferred job postings. However, there's an increase in the racial neutral job postings at the same time. We also wanted to test whether we have the pre-trends and how do these effects behave dynamically over time. And we do this using a dynamic effects or event study framework, where we split it here for the purpose of exposition, the markets that were above the median, which is 18.7, and we compare them with the markets that were below the median. So this is what we find. We find that there's a differential effect of 2.5 percentage point reductions in the high draft markets that persisted throughout the post-war period. This is particularly important, like over 8 and even 10 years after the war. However, all of these periods, the effects are negative and statistically significant. We also tested for pre-trends, and we find that that is not a concern in this case. At the same time, we also have produced the corresponding effects that I show you on the diff and diff with the Black and race neutral ads, and we find that there's no effects even in dynamics in the Black preferred job postings, and there's like a sustained increase in the race neutral ads. We do several specific robustness exercises that I'm going to skip for today. And just to give you a very clear and concise taste of the worker level analysis that we have, I'm going to jump to the specification. So we have a triple diff and diff where we are comparing workers that were living in markets that were more or less affected by the draft and who were either Black or white. And we want to see how does this racial gap for them evolves over time. We include a very extensive set of controls, including race by year G-fix effects to alleviate concerns regarding potential race-based migration patterns that also occur at this period of history. So I'm going to be reporting the effect of workers per a percentage point increase in the draft rate and also the total effect on Black workers. And what we find is that there was a convergence in wages to which these labor supply shortages contributed to, as the total effect on Black workers was positive, and the total effect on white workers was negative in their wage income. This is standardized, so there's an increase in 0.2 standard deviations per 10 percentage point increase in the draft rate. We see also a similar wage increase in the percentile rank of these Black workers and a decrease in the percentile rank of white workers. And finally, we also see that even at absolute levels, there's a decrease in the wages of white workers, and then there's an increase that here is not statistically significant for Black workers. So to conclude, we find that these war-induced labor shortages reduce explicit racial preferences in hiring. They improve Black workers' outcomes and wage convergence. And this is quite important as well because it's showing us that this was not only a supply-driven effect, but also that demand potentially changed to the point of altering the wages as well. And finally, there's several policy implications that can be also taken away from these paper, and I'm happy to be discussing them perhaps in the questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joan. And at least we close with a kind of positive note from your paper. So we are really running out of time, but if there is any quick question, I'm happy to take. Okay, then I think it's we can conclude. Thank you so much for presenting your work, and good luck with your research on this topic for the year ahead. So thank you so much. It was really nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Okay, bye,
Thank
bye,
you.
bye, bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye, bye.